We are starting this one with why the U.S. economy in the 1970s had become so stagnant and why we're going to get the term stagflation that's going to plague Ford and Carter's presidencies. So I started to talk about this in the last recording. I'm going to wrap it up here. So why did the U.S. economy become so stagnant? Federal deficits in the 1960s because of Johnson's Great Society programs and the escalation in Vietnam War. We're going to see internal competitions from Germany and Japan as far as them competing with production of American goods. We can see this greatly due to cars and electronics. U.S. is going to lose its economic power that it's had since the days following World War II. We are not modernizing our plants or seeking more efficient ways of production because we have grown pretty complacent. We have rising energy costs due to the situations going on in the Middle East, increased number of women and teenagers in the workforce that are taking part-time jobs and are less likely to develop skills in the long term that is going to push towards more higher paying careers. Our shifting economy is shifting from manufacturing to service industry, where production gains were more difficult to achieve. Military and welfare spending during the 1960s are going to give people money without adding to the supply of goods that those dollars can buy. So we end up getting stagflation in the mid-70s under Ford and Carter's presidencies. Stagflation is the slowing of productivity and rising inflation, which is a really rare thing to happen. Industry production is going to slow down when inflation hits at its highest at 11% in 74, and unemployment is going to be at 9% in 75. All right, so we have the election of 1972. The Democrats are going to nominate George McGovern. And George Wallace is going to run again, our friend from Alabama, as an American independent candidate. He is going to be shot on May 15th and left paralyzed below the waist. Richard Nixon and Spiro Agnew, our vice president, are going to be renominated by the Republican Party. Emphasis on his platform is going to be he won a democratic war in Vietnam and that we are now down to 30,000 troops. And Nixon's candidacy is going to receive a huge boost 12 days before the election when Kissinger announces that he has a peace deal in Vietnam and that they agree it would be signed within hopefully a few days. Of course, the agreement does not stick and the war is going to last a few more years, or another year actually, but it sounds good right before the election. So the resulting victory goes to Nixon, of course, in the Electoral College. 527 electoral votes to McGovern's 17. Majority of the populist vote also went to him, 47.1 million to 29.1. However, Nixon and the Republican Party are going to lose both houses of Congress, which is going to make it extremely difficult for Nixon to get any of his policies through. All right, let's talk about the biggest thing to happen in Nixon's presidency, and that, of course, is going to be Watergate. This is the biggest presidential scandal in all of U.S. history to date because Nixon is forced to resign. Nixon had surrounded himself with people who always agreed with him, which makes him a pretty isolated presidency. Nixon's men in 1971, are going to gather a list of about 200 individuals and 18 organizations that the administration is going to regard as their enemy towards Nixon's reelection. This includes Kennedy, McGovern, actors like Steve McQueen, Paul Newman, Jane Fonda, members of the media, leaderships in the House of Representatives, including the entire Black caucus or Black leadership, college presidents, etc. Nixon is going to ask the FBI to actually spy on these individuals to try to find things that they can use to discredit them. He's going to order the IRS to harass them with tax audits. the FBI is going to block an illegal Nixon plan for a secret police operation to combat anti-war movement that would have included the FBI, the CIA, the NSC, and military intelligence. And Nixon is worried that the anti-war movement would unseat him as president like it did with LBJ. So the committee to re-elect the president, known as CREEP, that is the worst acronym ever in U.S. history. The CREEP is worried about the outcome of the 1972 election because the Republican Party, they know, are not going to get the House or the Senate. And past losses to JFK in 1960 is going to kind of haunt Nixon. So CREEP becomes the massive illegal fundraising campaign, and the money is going to be set aside in a special fund to pay for dirty tricks operations against Nixon's Democratic opponents. So the White House plumbers instructed to stop any anti-Nixon leaks to the press, and with the New York Times publishing the Pentagon Papers stating the Gulf of Tonkin resolution had been based on a lie and discredited Johnson's motives for the war, Nixon feared that the leaks of any more classified documents would be damaging to his presidency. So we have the Watergate break-in 1972. Burglars that were hired by CREEP were caught breaking into the Democratic National Headquarters at the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C. Nixon and his aides, of course, deny any involvement and work on covering it up. Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein are the two Washington Post journalists who were going to break the story. And they're going to basically break the idea that the burglars and a White House aide that were involved in the burglary were actually employees of CREEP. They start to discover other illegal activities done by the presidential advisors, and there's Nixon authorizing $460,000 worth of payments to the CREEP fund to keep the Watergate burglars quiet about any White House connection. In 1973, there's a White House trial, and Senate hearings revealed Nixon and other White House officials had covered up their involvement and pressured defendants to plead guilty and remain silent. We have the Watergate tapes, which is basically what they find out is that Nixon had everything recorded in the Oval Office. He refuses to turn anything over to the Senate committees and claim executive privilege, stating releasing the tapes would endanger national security. Nixon is also going to announce the resignation of 3 of his closest aides who were quote-unquote involved in Watergate. The Saturday Night Massacre is Nixon firing 2 more of his men for refusing to fire the special prosecutor hired by the Senate committee to investigate Watergate. In 1973, Spiro Agnew, the vice president, is going to resign. He is going to plead no contest to charges of income tax evasion and accepting bribes while the governor of Maryland. Nixon is going to nominate Gerald Ford, a very popular conservative House minority leader who is also a graduate of the University of Michigan, but we won't talk about that. And Nixon was also forced to pay back taxes in the sum of $500,000 for tax evasion, and accused of using public funds for improvements to his private house in California and Florida. Nixon is finally going to release some of the Watergate tapes, but they're extremely edited, and all the incriminating portions have been erased. That's the critical 18-minute gap you may have heard about. So we get the Supreme Court case, U.S. versus Nixon, which ruled that President Nixon had to release the tapes, so national security aside, and then we start the impeachment proceedings. So both houses of Congress have to go agree on impeachment. So the House is the one that would vote to recommend the impeachment of President Nixon on 3 counts, which they do: obstructing justice, violating the rights of U.S. citizens by using the FBI, CIA, and IRS to harass critics, and defying congressional authority by refusing to turn over the tapes. And then on August 7th, Nixon is going to resign as president, because while the House brings up the charges, the Senate would convict him on the charges, and then Nixon would have been impeached. The Senate was going to vote to impeach Nixon, therefore he resigned to prevent the vote. The following day, Gerald Ford is going to be sworn in as president. The 25th Amendment makes Presidential Succession Act of 1947 an actual amendment to the Constitution. So if the president is removed from office, the vice president shall become president. This was enacted in 1967, and that is what we use in order for Gerald Ford to be sworn in as president. One of the first things within a month of office that Ford is going to do is he's going to pardon Nixon for any crimes he may have committed while president. And this is not going to make the people very, very happy. And this is actually what's going to cost, many believe, Gerald Ford the presidential election in 1976 when he runs. All right, and then we get to the War Powers Act of 1973, which we've covered pretty heavily. You can see the post here. Here's the cover of Times, Nixon in the court. So this is the U.S. versus Nixon, and this is Gerald Ford being sworn in as president.